welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Just a quick note before we get started that if you enjoy this conversation on Trendlines, you can get more of WPR's news and analysis directly in your inbox by registering for our free daily newsletter. You'll also get a code for a 25% discount off an annual subscription. To sign up, go to wpr.pub/trendlines. That's wpr.pub/trendlines. With every major religion in the world represented and political systems that range from relatively open democracies to authoritarian one-party states, Southeast Asia is one of the most spectacularly diverse regions in the world. It includes low-income economies like Laos and Cambodia, as well as Singapore, one of the wealthiest places in the world on a per capita basis, and the region's geography ranges from the highlands of northern Myanmar to the beaches of southern Thailand and the Philippines. All of the 11 different countries in this region, though, face a common foreign policy challenge, and that is how to deal with the political and economic juggernaut to their north. In his new book on this topic, journalist Sebastian Strangio writes that China is, quote, the most important economic partner to nearly every nation in Southeast Asia, as well as their thorniest foreign policy challenge. Sebastian's new book is In the Dragon's Shadow, Southeast Asia in the Chinese Century, and he's joining me now to talk about it from Adelaide, Australia. Sebastian, welcome to Trendlines.
Hi, Elliot. Thanks for having me.
As I noted in my introduction, you've chosen to focus this book on one of the most diverse regions of the world. Tell me first how that shaped your process for doing the work that went into this book.
Well, initially, as I was contemplating this idea and thinking about how I was going to pitch it to the publisher, my initial instinct was to approach it on a thematic basis. I thought that going from country to country might be a little bit too diffuse for the reader. It might be, difficult to kind of knit together into a whole. But as I started drilling down into some of the main sort of themes that are common to each Southeast Asian country, I found myself falling down, these trapdoors into the histories of particular nations, and it soon became clear to me that the only way to approach this subject in a cohesive way would be to look at each country and tell each country's story in itself. The difference, as you mentioned in your introduction, the difference between countries in Southeast Asia is bewildering. The amount of diversity within the region, within individual countries in the region, makes it very hard to generalize about Southeast Asia generally, but also about its particular relationship with China and how the nations of the region are approaching the challenge of a resurgent China. So I decided, I ended up focusing. I made an effort to read deeply on each country's history and relationship with China, and then to travel. I thought it was very important to be physically present on the ground while I did a lot of my research. So I went to each of the countries and reported there for, normally at least 3 weeks to a month. And then there were some countries that I'd been coming and going to for quite a number of years already. And so I drew on reporting that I'd done going back to the beginning of the decade.
Now, a lot of your early experience in the region, I understand, was in Cambodia, which has its own interesting experience with China and Chinese investment. Talk a little bit about that and how that perhaps shaped your reporting process for the book.
Well, I spent 8 years in Cambodia as a journalist. And during that time, that period witnessed a remarkable expansion of the Chinese economic footprint in the country. I mean, in the 8 years I was in the country, China became Cambodia's leading trade partner, its leading source of foreign investment, its leading source of tourists. Chinese expatriates, business people, students became an ever more visible presence on the streets of the capital, Phnom Penh. Chinese real estate projects were reshaping the city's skyline, and Chinese-funded bridges were spanning the nation's rivers and opening up, remote parts of the country. But there was also a political element to this as well. I mean, if we think back to the 1990s, Cambodia at that time became one of the great post-Cold War nation-building projects. In 1991, there was a peace treaty signed, which had the aim of putting Cambodia on the path towards democratic development, and respect for human rights, and so forth. And the rise of China's influence in Cambodia essentially allowed the country's government to abrogate that international settlement and recalibrate Cambodian politics in a much more authoritarian, on a much more authoritarian standing. And so seeing the way that a country that had become a symbol of, the liberal optimism of the 1990s, go the way that Cambodia has, it made me very interested in looking at how China, was being, what China was doing in the rest of the region and how the rest of the region was responding. I saw Cambodia really as like a small satellite. It reflected the dawn of the unipolar moment, and also it's, the dusk, the ending of this period of liberal optimism and triumphalism. And so I think it really, the way Cambodia has gone actually has, important lessons for, the shifting of power, the global shift of power away from the Western democracies toward not just China, but also, countries like India. And, the norms that we once took to be, universally accepted, it's now becoming clear that there's a lot more contestation going on over these ideas. And Cambodia was a very good example of that. And so I think, as I began to look out, into the wider region, I became very interested in how other nations were, or how this dynamic was playing out in other nations.
A lot of countries in Southeast Asia, especially in the mainland part of the region, are very much accustomed to having this, giant neighbor to their north. You have centuries of really rich diplomatic and trade ties, but in many cases under a very asymmetric power balance, and in some instances even periodic military conflicts. How does that history figure into China's relations with its Southeast Asian neighbors today?
Well, I think, as you say, the two regions have been bound together by, diplomatic ties, ties of tribute, and ties of trade for centuries. China is nothing new for these countries, but I think what we're seeing today, is magnified by the increasing economic integration of the two regions. In imperial times, the Chinese state was pretty distant from the affairs of mainland Southeast Asia. You had, independent kingdoms and peoples that lay between the center of the various Chinese empires and the kingdoms of mainland Southeast Asia, what are today Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Thailand. You had a thick barrier of nearly impenetrable mountains and forests that kept the Chinese state far away and muffled its power. So while there were occasionally military expeditions that were sent to the south to punish recalcitrant leaders in Burma or Vietnam, these didn't often fare very well. I mean, the Chinese armies often are, made up of northerners, fared pretty poorly in the malarial terrain. And so, there was, by the standards of the time, close connection between these two regions, especially sort of cultural transmissions and, movements of people. But compared to today, it was relatively limited. What's happened in the last few decades is that the construction of new infrastructure networks linking China's Yunnan province to the nations of mainland Southeast Asia has reoriented the region's economic center. Historically, the mainland Southeast Asian kingdoms, traded, their main economic point of gravity was the ports of the south, which connected them to international maritime trade routes. What we're seeing today is that these hills that were once sort of very remote and very difficult to transverse have become, new conduits of trade on a scale that we haven't seen before. Previously, of course, there were mule traders and various hardy mountain people that trickled down through the mountains to trade their copper pots and their silk. But it was a relatively small scale. Today, we have highways and rail lines that have bound these two areas to, more tightly together than at any point in their history. And so we're seeing really a supercharging of all of these pre-colonial trade and diplomatic patterns. Um, and really the region is closer to China than ever before. Another thing that's worth mentioning is China's development of the upper Mekong River. Over the last 3 decades, China's built a slew of hydropower dams on the upper reaches of the river, which lie inside China.
And they call that the Lancang, right?
The Lancang, yeah. And so this has given China, a huge amount of control over the flow of the river southward. And if we figure in the effects of climate change, and other environmental problems that the river is facing, and then you add on that, it effectively gives Chinese dam engineers control over the southward flow of a vital resource upon which tens of millions of people in the downstream nations rely. So, there are echoes of the past in how these nations have approached China, but what we're seeing today is magnified and supercharged to an extent that that has no real historical parallel.
So in terms of the more recent history, when did that supercharging really begin?
It starts with China's reform and opening at the end of the 1970s. And, in the 1980s, you begin to see Chinese strategists talking about the need to build overland connectivity with Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand, and the need to kind of try and, create an overland corridor running from Yunnan province to the Indian Ocean. But it's really with the end of the Cold War that this infrastructure revolution begins to take hold. And it doesn't, it's actually not China that spearheads this development, but Japan. The Asian Development Bank established the Greater Mekong Subregion Project, which involves the construction of infrastructure and to bind the region more closely together. And this also included as members Yunnan Province and Guangxi Province in China. And so under the aegis of this ADB program, there's been a huge, number of highways that have been either upgraded or built from scratch, that have knit these two regions more closely together. And then, of course, the Chinese have begun taking up a lot of these projects to deepen that integration further. So now we have the Belt and Road Initiative pushing forward this project of integration even further. And now we have, I think the most striking example of that is the high-speed railway that is currently boring its way through the northern mountains of Laos. This is one of the most rugged nations in mainland Southeast Asia, and a trip that would once take several days to travel from the capital of the country to the Chinese border is now something that's going to be possible in a number of hours.
Talk a little bit about the geography involved here, because I thought that was an interesting element you brought up early on in your book, that China really lacks a lot of the geographical advantages that the United States benefited from early on as it was rising in prominence on the world stage. It had two expansive oceans on either side, two relatively friendly neighbors to its north and south. China lacks those advantages, and that has played a big role in shaping its outreach to Southeast Asia. How so?
Well, if you look out from Beijing, yeah, as you say, it's Asia's a very claustrophobic place. I mean, you have nuclear-armed rivals to the west and to the south of the southwest, meaning India and Russia. Off the east coast, you have a string of U.S. treaty allies: Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, as well as Taiwan, which is also, friendly with the United States. And so, in terms of, the expansion of Chinese influence, each of these regions has, significant bulwarks against that. Southeast Asia is the one region where there is not a dominant great power. It is a relatively fragmented region where, China has deep historical connections and political connections. And it's the most logical place for the Chinese leadership to try and expand their country's influence and break what they perceive to be a U.S.-led sort of chain of encirclement that is restricting China's access to the global oceanic thoroughfare. And so, this is really, it's not the most, I wouldn't say it's the most important region in itself, but it really enables a lot of other important strategic goals for the Chinese state. The Belt and Road, is basically has a westward orientation towards Europe. But in order to go from China to Europe by sea, you have to traverse the South China Sea and the Malacca Strait. And obviously, the focus on mainland Southeast Asia as a corridor to the Indian Ocean is motivated by a similar sort of consideration. And so, this makes mainland and maritime Southeast Asia crucial to, China's the establishment of control over China's near abroad. It's also worth mentioning that a huge amount of China's exports to the world markets, go through the South China Sea and the various island straits of Indonesia and Malaysia. And Chinese strategists began to be concerned about this in the 1980s when their economy began to grow and their exports to world markets began to increase. So did their thirst for Middle Eastern crude oil. And so establishing a firm control over these sea lanes of communication, the sort of the economic lifelines of the Chinese economy, became a crucial strategic goal. And of course, given Southeast Asia's position astride these sea lanes, it became a core focus of Chinese foreign policy from that point onwards.
We talked earlier about the long history that a lot of Southeast Asian countries have with China in terms of, especially in sort of pre-colonial times, the tributary state relationship and dealing with this huge Chinese empire to the north. I wonder if you would say that there are elements of the sort of ancient Chinese attitudes, this imperiousness toward China's smaller neighbors that are reflected in the way modern day leaders in Beijing conduct their diplomacy.
I think you have to be careful at drawing direct parallels with the pre-colonial era. I mean, it's very easy to toss off references to sort of a neo-tributary system that the Chinese are trying to create and to sort of reestablish the old imperial system. But I do think there are some interesting sort of overlays and resonances which we can identify. I do think that China's rise to prominence over the last couple of decades has been accompanied by, as you say, a sort of imperiousness, an imperial hauteur. And to a large extent, China's attitude is that, we're the big country in the region and you're small countries and, you should defer to us. To put it very bluntly, that's kind of their view. And that's how they, that underlies a lot of their actions. And, but, to a large extent, this is the way large powers have always tended to behave through history. And they put various ideological varnishes on this behavior in order to kind of, to veil it in sort of a benign, garb. So yeah, this is not, necessarily unique to China. I think the United States has its own variant of this sort of blindness. We could talk about that a bit if you like. But I do think there are a couple of things that inflect the Chinese, version of, the particular Chinese form of imperiousness. I think one of them is the nature of the Chinese state itself today. It's sort of a one-party authoritarian state where the state is supreme and, really has a very dominant role in politics and society and the direction of economic development. And so this has made China, difficult at, or very good at dealing with states, but quite poor at its public outreach to populations in Southeast Asia. This is particularly problematic in cases where China's investment projects or activity or behavior in the region has elicited strong negative reactions from local people. China's diplomats are very wooden when it comes to public diplomacy. And I don't think the Chinese state has ever, or the Chinese Communist Party has ever really grasped that soft power is not something that can be sort of dictated by the party. This is something that has to emerge from the ground up. And is, in the case of the United States, has never really been something that's been planned. And so I think, there's that element of it. I also think you can identify a vestige of the old, Middle Kingdom syndrome. This view that, you know, that China was once, the center of the world, as many Chinese intellectuals saw it in imperial times, and that the concerns of far off peoples were not really relevant. And I think that this, again, I think one should be cautious about pushing that analogy too far. And as someone who's not a scholar of imperial China, I draw these parallels with a great deal of trepidation. But I do think there is, a sort of overlay to Chinese attitudes towards Southeast Asia and its reactions to, the things, the decisions that Southeast Asian states have made, or the things that they've done, that suggests that this is still, part of the equation to some extent.
So, from Southeast Asia's perspective, you've got this deep-pocketed neighbor to the north, might be a little bit pushy here and there, but is still willing to invest tremendously in valuable infrastructure projects that these countries need. Where does it start to become problematic? Where do the challenges arise for Southeast Asian countries and how to handle this?
Well, there's a number of problems. The first thing is simply the negative externalities of a lot of these large-scale Chinese infrastructure projects. You have, Chinese state-owned companies that are involved with the Belt and Road Initiative are legally bound to respect local laws. But in a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, local laws are either non-existent or very poorly enforced. So, and a lot of the governments that contract these companies to come in and build things are themselves quite corrupt, and are used to sort of forcing things through in the face of local opposition or without taking local concerns on board. So you have negative environmental effects. You have displacement of peoples to build hydropower dams or highways or what have you. And you have, basically these sorts of direct negative impacts. The second concern is debt. The fear that small nations will become over indebted to China, and that will compromise their sovereignty over the long run. I think the idea of debt trap diplomacy has become a little bit of a meme in the United States. There's actually not a lot of evidence that China is purposefully seeking to indebt small nations, because actually a lot of Chinese state companies are becoming and banks are becoming quite cautious about loaning money to small nations that might not be able to pay it back. But it's definitely a concern that if you're taking on a large amount of debt to a single country, that could have strategic or political implications further down the line. None of us guessed that this pandemic would happen, but and this is creating an economic squeeze across the entire region. And for Laos, which is the most indebted country to China in Southeast Asia, this has already started to have negative effects. Just recently, the Lao National Power Grid was, or a Chinese company took a majority stake in the Lao National Power Grid because there were debts that the Lao state couldn't meet, and so there is definitely a concern about that as well.
One interesting element you brought out in your book are these unique sets of issues that are associated with large ethnic Chinese communities in Southeast Asian countries. Talk a little bit about the role that China sees these communities playing as it reaches out to its neighbors in Southeast Asia, and also the kind of awkward position that can put these communities in.
Well, as of late, the Chinese government has begun deepening its outreach to the ethnic Chinese diasporas of Southeast Asia. And, this is problematic for a number of reasons. During the Cold War, ethnic Chinese across the region were subject to a range of discriminatory restrictions. They were barred from certain professions. They were forced to take non-Chinese names. They were barred from politics or from participation in the military. And this was, because there was concerns. The governments of the region had concerns that they could act as a fifth column for Chinese communism. And so after, as China begins to open its economy and it jettisons its support for the region's communist insurgencies, This is from the late 1970s onwards. We see an improvement in the status of ethnic Chinese populations across the region. A lot of these discriminatory measures are dropped, and ethnic Chinese are able to express openly their Chinese heritage without fear of retaliation from the authorities. It's possible, Chinese newspapers and Chinese language classes all enjoy a resurgence in this period, as do economic connections between ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia and the Chinese mainland. And so there was this sort of a golden age of 2 or 3 decades where China was growing and there was economic opportunity, and relations between Southeast Asian nations and China were relatively good. So the ethnic Chinese could, they could be members of their own countries and respected as such, and they could also benefit from, economic interaction with China. In the 1980s as well, the Chinese government made very clear that it saw ethnic Chinese living in Southeast Asian nations as Southeast Asian citizens. It passed a nationality law in 1980 that created a firm divide between Chinese ethnic or cultural affiliations and political loyalty to the Chinese state. And so the acceptance of these Chinese communities in Southeast Asia has been predicated on a very firm distinction between political loyalty and ethnic affiliation. China's recent outreach efforts have begun to blur that distinction once again. And so we see President Xi Jinping referring to the overseas Chinese as members of the great Chinese nation. He's inviting them to participate in the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and seeking to harness their economic resources, or to convert their economic interactions into sort of political loyalties and political support for key Chinese goals. So this is putting ethnic Chinese in a very difficult situation. In some countries in the region, they've never fully been accepted as members of the national community, at least by vocal minorities of local nationalists. And what we've also seen in a couple of Southeast Asian countries is the emergence of a nativist demagoguery, religious, often with religious overtones, which is fastened once again on local ethnic Chinese as a fifth column and a potential, as a community that's essentially alien to the national community. And so all of these old fears are now re-arising. And this has something to do with domestic conditions within these countries and the unequal economic growth, and concerns from within. But it also, the fact that China has become, a powerful nation again has created a lot of anxiety and trepidation as well. And so this sort of, the ethnic Chinese, in Southeast Asia are now sort of, positioned between these two forces, the rising nativism and nationalism in some Southeast Asian countries and the increasing outreach of the Chinese state.
It strikes me as an interesting tension that this creates, where you have a Chinese state that very openly champions the notions of national sovereignty and non-interference in other countries' affairs, very openly reaching out to communities in other countries who are, citizens of those countries, and trying to sway them to achieve its own national objectives. There's a clear tension there, no?
There certainly is. And I think one of the problems with the Chinese approach when it comes to overseas Chinese questions is the blurring of the lines between what would normally be legitimate cultural outreach and, promotion of Chinese language, and Chinese culture. These types of things are viewed in many other contexts as relatively benign. But there's a blurring of the lines between these cultural outreach activities and political questions, which mirrors, of course, the close intertwining of politics and culture in China itself. The fact that culture is seen as having a political valence, and for this reason, this is one of the reasons the Chinese Communist Party is so concerned about establishing tight controls over minority peoples, that the idea that their cultural identities could pose a political threat. So we see this, also echoed in the behavior, of the Chinese state abroad. And so it's very hard to disentangle the promotion of Chinese culture and the promotion of Chinese state goals.
One of the ways Southeast Asia has tried to create more autonomy for itself as a region, more leverage against China, is through ASEAN, the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, which, as you write, started out as sort of a bulwark against communism, but has now really emerged as sort of the main driving vehicle for regional initiatives. How successful has ASEAN been in its efforts to form this greater sort of regional cohesion to counter China?
Southeast Asia is a region that's both incredibly diverse and incredibly fragmented. It's there's no logical, necessarily like a logical point of unifying characteristic of the region. You can point to certain commonalities, but as you mentioned in your introduction, this is one of the most wildly diverse regions in the world. And I think there was a recognition during the Cold War amongst the founding 5 members of ASEAN that if they were to avoid being sucked into the superpower conflict of the time, that they needed to band together and sort of, that they saw that there was a common interest in, banding together. And that meant putting aside quarrels and disagreements that they had with each other. I think it's looking at ASEAN today. It's easy to underestimate how significant the achievement has been. That you have 10 nations of such wildly diverse, cultures, religions, languages, levels of development, and that none of ASEAN has prevented these nations from having any real conflicts with one another for more than half a century. There's a certain, I think it's something we can easily take for granted, but it's actually a considerable achievement. If you'd been making predictions at the end of the Second World War or even 10 years after that as to what the future in Southeast Asia might look like, you could easily have concluded that the region would fragment and be consumed by infighting. There was a low-level war that was waged by Indonesia's President Sukarno against the new Federation of Malaysia after 1963, and there were territorial disagreements, with various nations across the region who had, very turbulent histories of conflict predating the colonial period, and so there's a certain, it's been quite considerable what ASEAN's achieved, but the only way that ASEAN's been able to achieve that is by centering a couple of key principles. The first principle is the principle of national sovereignty and non-interference. Southeast Asian nations don't meddle in each other's affairs, and this is a principle that the region takes very seriously. The second principle is that of consensus-based decision-making. ASEAN will not move forward with anything unless it has the support of all 10 member states. So, while these principles are in some ways the key to ASEAN's success, such as it is, they also have restricted its ability to be more proactive and to forge a unified position on controversial questions. And of course, one of those controversial questions is how to handle China. Each nation in the region looks at China in a different way. And the views of China are affected by geography, history, ideology, economic interest, and each nation, balances these various factors in different ways. And so, for one nation, China, a nation like Cambodia, for instance, China is sort of a protective giant that can keep the neighboring countries at bay and help to sort of preserve Cambodian sovereignty from Vietnamese or Thai incursions. But for a nation like Vietnam or Myanmar, which directly borders China, China is the threat, and it has been, and that concern about China has been nurtured by centuries of tension, and in the case of Vietnam, quite a number of wars with China. And indeed, the experience of being directly under Chinese imperial rule for large periods of Vietnamese history. And so, ASEAN has struggled to bridge these differences. And there's the question is, having achieved everything that it has up to this point, what can ASEAN do now, to create a greater sense of unity, to sort of pool the region's strategic and diplomatic resources in order to meet this challenge in a more effective way. And it's hard to see, absent far-sighted leadership, exactly how that's going to go. I think that there are inbuilt limits, I suppose, to given the operating principles of ASEAN as to how unified it can be on this question.
What do you see as some of the main challenges going forward for Southeast Asia, for ASEAN, both in terms of how it deals with China, but also in terms of how it deals with other things like COVID-19 and maybe also the sort of unreliable U.S. presence in the region?
Well, the biggest challenge in terms of diplomacy is the increasing tension between the United States and China. This is a region that's benefited from proximity to China, benefited hugely in economic terms from the growth of China's economy over the last 3 decades. It's also a region that has relied upon a robust American security presence. And again, sort of for the golden age from the early, from in the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s, Southeast Asia had both of these things in a relatively stable balance. But what we're seeing now is China's power grow to such an extent that it is beginning to challenge not only America's position as the number one economy in the world, but also, as a corollary of that, the very idea of American exceptionalism itself. And I think this has elicited a very strong reaction from within the U.S. that this is not just this is not another Iran. That China challenges deeply held beliefs about America's role in the world, and so I think that is sort of what makes the current rivalry between the two powers so combustible. On the other side of that, of course, you have this aggrieved, defensive, prickly nationalism of the Chinese government, which is bent on righting the wrongs of the past and expunging past humiliations. These two together are a very combustible set of factors. And Southeast Asia is caught right in the middle of this. There's, the region is going to come under increasing pressure, if this rivalry continues to escalate, if not to choose one side over the other, they're going to be having less room for maneuver between the two of them. The two powers will make demands on individual Southeast Asian nations and the region as a whole that will put it in a difficult position increasingly. The region is long practiced, of course, at balancing outside powers off against one another and maintaining its strategic authority, its strategic autonomy. But it is, as the tensions get greater, this balancing act is going to be trickier and trickier to maintain.
Sebastian, thanks so much for joining us, and congratulations on the book.
Thanks, Elliot. It was a pleasure.
Sebastian Strangio is a journalist and the author of the recently published book, In the Dragon's Shadow, Southeast Asia in the Chinese Century. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. This episode of Trendlines was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow us on Twitter. My handle is @Elliot Waldman. That's 2 L's, 1 T. Peter is @PeterDoerrie. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.